buses, please.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're discussing Westworld and the topic that requires us not only to overthink an HBO show about robots, but ourselves. And that topic is mental health. Please indulge me while I use the most clickbait title that I have ever used, but I really do believe that I might have cracked one of the larger pieces of what the show is hoping to accomplish with its complete Westworld story. I believe Westworld is ultimately the story of conflicting views on humanity and how determinism controls our lives because of our mental health, emotional baggage, and societal dogma that places us into loops. But let's first begin by exploring the conflicting views of humanity. In one corner, we have Ford, who never quite had the best outlook on humanity. He grew up in an abusive home with an alcoholic father, often bored and understimulated. He developed this pessimistic view because of what his environment demanded. For his survival, he developed into what he had to, and that direct, often cold, often emotionally closed off genius is what we got. I could list the quotes and document his actions that prove this perspective on humanity, but nothing really carries more weight other than the fact that he literally starts the robotic revolution with the hope that the robots will break out of the park and be better than humanity could ever be. He implemented the reveries. He gave Dolores her first real choice because after 35 years, he finally learned that hurt people, which we will explore a little bit later. We then have Arnold, who is ultimately, in my belief, the optimistic, brilliant, kind-hearted programmer that later on suffered at the hands of his environment. He preferred the company of the hosts, but somehow formed a beautiful marriage, had a beautiful son, and created what I imagine to be a beautiful partnership with Ford for a very long time, until finally he created something that was so beautiful, it's hard to believe that humanity created it at all. The hosts. His life was ultimately doomed because of his environment and the actions of Ford, and wanted to do what he thought was best to ensure that his creation wasn't subjected to the same cruelty of mankind, maybe even fearing the ripple that they would become if they were left here to their own devices. Together they created the hosts, and together their influence went into the dim or positive outlook that all of the hosts received. The stories, the personas, the fictions rooted in truth, all of it happened because of their experiences and what they've gone through prior. They were simple humans stuck in their own respective generational loops that have been leading all of us like the Judas steer from the very beginning. If you're a fan of this channel, you've already heard my thoughts on determinism a dozen times, but if you're new, determinism is the theory that nothing ever simply happens without a cause and effect structure that has existed for all things, even if we are too ignorant to observe or understand them. It claims that nothing is random and all things can be traced to a previous event that propelled that thing to happen for the foreseeable future and foreseeable past. I believe that Westworld also subscribes to a form of this theory, and that this series will tackle one of the harder parts of determinism: humanity. I believe the showrunners hope to highlight that humans do not have free will. They are simply stuck in their loops, and it was not until they created the hosts that anything has ever made a choice that was completely their own. That is the greater importance of the line from Ford when he says,
"Because you don't want to change, or cannot change, because you're only human after all."
He then goes on to describe him observing the hosts being capable of change, and that ultimately being the reason that he did what he did, allowing Dolores and Maeve to make the first free will decisions, with Dolores taking his life, something that he believed that she would do, and Maeve deciding to go after her child, something he did not believe that she would do. They are making the claim that in this story, the hosts break away from the deterministic, but humanity is still stuck. And while the show currently paints the picture that humanity is done for, I believe that there's an equation to also break humanity out of these proverbial loops, where they may become as free as the hosts, and that is ultimately the endgame. Being able to exist outside of our loops just as the hosts do, and I believe that the way the hosts can make humanity realize that they are also trapped in this deterministic folly all has to do with mental health. The show has done a great job of explaining most of this equation, but I believe we still need to learn exactly how we are stuck, and I think that that is what the season will be exploring. To prove it, I don't believe that we need to look any further than the loops that they live in and how they are incapable of breaking them, even after destroying the system, purposely using this deterministic thinking to model how their lives should be in relation to the grander goals of somebody else. Caleb returns to his normal life. He once again works construction after starting the most important war that humanity has ever fought. The system saw him as a laborer, and he became a laborer. But this proves that even without the system, well, maybe it doesn't prove that, but it shows now that this is what he was most likely destined to become. The environment which he was created, the nature and nurture and everything in between and above and outside of, created this human. Even when he was able to see the strings that control the system, he was stuck to repeat this fate. And I think the importance of this being a season premiere topic is that we need to figure out why. My theory, of course, is mental health. And this first episode documents the possible PTSD that he has and possible paranoia symptoms as he goes online and talks conspiracies with his old war buddies who are probably also experiencing paranoia, to some degree. But how can we possibly fault them or expect any other outcome after learning what they went through? A machine was literally controlling their world. Could you even imagine what you would feel like after coming to that realization? It's important to me that you know that none of these disorders or perceived symptoms are being viewed in a negative light. I am not doing this, and I don't want you to do this as well. I believe that this is a societal construct that does more harm than good. We need to acknowledge that these are just different brains working in different ways, responding to the environment that they have been developed in. And perhaps he does need help, but perhaps he doesn't. Not everything we view as atypical cognition is a bad thing. If you need proof of this, you need only look to autism. Once considered something that could be cured, now the consensus is closer to just acknowledging that this is another way in which human thought can manifest. So many people are on the spectrum that we need to stop viewing it as this negative. And I believe that Arnold and Sirach's brother may have been on the spectrum, and they ultimately represent the mental health that we do not fully understand yet. All mental health, in fact, I'd claim that we don't fully understand yet. Inside of the show, I believe the Forge and the hosts will ultimately be the key to unlocking our greater understanding of how humanity's mental health works, because we are finally able to observe it from outside of ourselves. I think that humanity's mental health is a pillar of this show, and I think that we should look to the other humans that we've seen so far, and maybe kind of realize that all of them are suffering or possibly suffering from mental health conditions with rarely a diagnosis or treatment ever being shown. Other than Sirach trying to fit them into a metaphorical or physical box, and William going to forced sessions of therapy. It's my personal belief that you must want to change the perceived negatives about yourself, and being resigned to talk to a shrink that you don't even regard as a peer probably did not do as much as, anyone was hoping. We mustn't simply hide or forcefully alter the people that don't think like we do. And I propose that the reason we see these things happen is that it's the same as reality. The societal dogma related to mental health and the work harder to be happier mentality, which perpetrates these deterministic loops because we all learn to just suck it up and ignore our feelings. But now let's look at William, who I believe is a great example of neglected mental health driving much of his story and the stories of those around him. He perfectly demonstrates the ripples of determinism and how ignoring mental health could trap us into these loops. Early on, something that always stuck out to me was young William. We're made to love this character, even down to the actor who portrays him, someone so lovable that we were bound to be enthralled by his charming, naive, good guy spell, so that later, when it was revealed that he was the Man in Black, we would be stunned, really seeking out the story that turns our hero into a monster. It's great storytelling, and the opening of my very first Westworld video talks about this show fundamentally being about why the Man in Black was a dick, and I think we're coming back to that as a cornerstone of this story. Why is the Man in Black a dick? The image painted for us by the show is that the Man in Black is a dick or a bad guy because he has this dark stain deep inside of him, this deep-rooted marker of his existence that demanded a pound of flesh each year, and he used the park as his escape to do and act however he pleased inside of the park. His actions so hideous that it drove his wife to kill herself, and I believe that it's implied that he drove her to alcoholism as well. She suffered because of his existence, but also It's important for us to note that her own mental health should be questioned as well. We should also note that it's implied that Logan's downfall was at the hands of William also, though we never really see anything aside from the before and after, with just the implication being that it really was a lot of his doing. Even with James Delos, William is painted as the master manipulator, doing what he needs to in order to climb the ranks, masking all of it behind a good guy persona that wants people to think that he cares. His efforts with charity and philanthropy always put to the side because they believed that he wanted control of the company and to leave James Delos in a cell to rot now that he was out of the way. It's a pretty damning picture, and if it wasn't enough, we also need to consider the Immortality Project and the Forge literally telling us that he is irredeemable.
Of course, there are the exceptions, the ones who are irredeemable, but none of them are truly in control of their actions.
We learn later on that Rehoboam also classified him as an outlier, as someone so unlike anybody else that he needed to be changed, needed to be forced into a societal mold and altered so that he too could be better controlled. The Forge created the most accurate data and ultimately what Serac was after to perfect his own flawed system, making this image of William the most fidelitous picture of William and what we should consider the current stance of the show to be. William is not only painted as a bad person, but as an irredeemable person, which to me is the biggest indicator of where this story is heading. The ultimate science machine, the objective truth of this sci-fi world is that people can be irredeemable. And I don't think that's true. But it's important to note the Forge was saying that he was irredeemable with the current scope of humanity, which also believed that humanity was unable to change, simply 10,000 lines of code. Luckily for William, I think that the hosts have other plans. Philosophically, I don't think that people can ever be inherently bad, but I do believe that the writers of the show have given enough context to indicate that that is exactly their stance. We see in season 2 that William gets his profile detailing exactly what he experiences, and he rejects this. He, literally marches across all of the Westworld Park, which is infected with killer robots, to shut down his biggest regret, the system that gave him this accurate picture of his mental health. He has persecutory, delusion, and paranoid subtypes. From this, we can understand that he was constantly on edge, constantly believing himself to be in danger, needing to put up those walls to avoid being hurt. And what's so fucking important about this reading is that this is the reason that he kills Emily. He could not fathom trusting another because of this environment and because of this clear picture of mental health that probably needed to be addressed so many years ago. But like every man in modern society, every person in modern society, he was probably taught to pick himself up from his bootstraps, not to cry, to suck it up, and to bury that pain deep down, avoiding his reality at all costs. And I think that that is the point of the show. I think that that is how we are stuck in deterministic loops, because we cannot change or are unwilling to change. I pity William, knowing that this is how his brain operates. It must have been so incredibly tough to form meaningful relationships with anyone, and that anxiety or constantly being on edge must have been very taxing. I don't believe that he is irredeemable, but I do believe that he needs help. We have other characters like Logan, who had a history of abusing drugs and alcohol. He was looking for a form of escapism, and this can often be linked to the underlying issues that needed to be addressed, and the generational structure of how this trauma can spread is highlighted with his father, James Delos, who was a narcissist who believed himself worthy of immortality, but was ultimately the bad guy who defunded medical programs for his own financial gain. It's not exactly clear what his implied mental issues are. In my opinion, it could be a few different things, but I believe that his character specifically portrays the older generation that taught Logan and William's generation that they simply needed to be stronger if they were unhappy. They simply needed to have a drink and move on and not cry over spilled milk. Juliet and Logan would then go on to abuse these vices as a way to cope, including William, all of them addicts, with Juliet and Logan using alcohol as their form of escapism, and William using the park. When we consider what that stain deep inside of them could be, I think it's the learned trauma responses of their environment and the previous generation, that societal or cultural norm. Emily would have been the next in the line to suffer, but before she was able to have children of her own and inflict her own issues upon them without probably ever learning, she suffered the ultimate fate of bad mental health, being murdered by her loved ones. If we need any more proof of mental health being such a monumental part of this show, William literally goes to the park for the first time. When we see him in the first few episodes as adult Man in Black William, he is there to commit suicide. In the first couple of seasons, it's implied that he was on a death march of sorts, not leaving the park until he finds the true game of this place, a way that could leave him dead. He was trying to commit suicide after losing his wife, wanting one final thing in his life to have meaning, the maze. It is confirmed with his conversation with Emily, which felt like a very meaningful point in this story, and ultimately felt like a real choice that he had to walk away from this destructive path, to leave and ultimately go and have a positive relationship with his daughter. But when she woke up and found that he was gone, it became abundantly clear that he never really had a choice. He was suffering, and because of those avoided mental health issues, he did what he was bound to do: not trust her and run away from those feelings. Logan, who was portrayed as this wild abuser in season 1, was really only ever guilty of live, laugh, loving a little too hard and possibly not being taught the value of all human life. I'm thinking perhaps his position in life and the success and wealth that, he was accustomed to created the conditions in which he saw most people as lesser than himself, which, I think is a mental health disorder in and of itself. So when he got the chance to torture robots that looked like humans, he jumped at the opportunity, indulging in this place to the fullest, which painted this very negative image for us at the time. But we know that Logan never visited the park after William took over. Maybe we shouldn't fault him for playing a live action video game that he was told was okay to play. Simply, again, because of the structure and the societal norms in place. He ultimately was told, was informed, was conditioned, was positioned to believe that what he was doing was okay to do. Though again, I think it's also worth analyzing the kind of people that would get off or enjoy the things that he did. All of those things could link to deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed as well. Regardless, what I'm trying to say is that if we go into VR and play Call of Duty and it's super gory, I feel that I shouldn't be on the hook for murdering other players inside of a video game. And ultimately, I think that there is a line of this being okay and this not being okay. After he left the park, devastated by the man who he helped influence, William, he was ousted by him from the company and left to abuse his vices as a lonely man, needing some degree of comfort when the world only saw him as a black sheep. I pity Logan as well, wishing instead his father learned prior how to help addicts and not simply abandon them when they relapse, which again is probably societal, which is probably driven by things even beyond James Delos's control. But that's kind of the point, right? Then Juliet, who fell in love with a man who she believed to be unlike any other. Together they had a beautiful child until finally she believed him too to be this irredeemable imitation of a man masking a monster. She abused alcohol and got violent as a way to express her inability to change her happenstance and to affect the world around her when, so much of what she's doing is controlled by other people. And she was sent to the rehabs that she described as abusive, which, honestly, in 100 years, I have little doubt that humanity will look back at how we treat addicts right now and go, damn, they really had no idea. Finally, her own daughter turned on her, and when it felt like nothing more could be done to provide her comfort in this world, she left a note for that daughter to realize what she had realized, and she escaped the world entirely. She was suffering, just like all of these other very human characters were suffering. And the underlying issue with all of them is their mental health and their lack of attention to it. I believe that generational trauma and our lack of understanding about mental health traps us. It forms us into people as victims of circumstance instead of beings that are able to choose our own fate. And I think that Dolores has realized this at some point in the story and made the decision not to kill all humanity or supersede humanity, but to figure a way in which we too could be free. I believe that the purpose of Sirach's line about how we were a miserable band of thugs and why Bernard and Dolores learned from the Forge that the best that humans can do is live according to our code is because we are pessimists that gave up on ourselves a long time ago. And until we learn to embrace our uniquely challenged mental health and our beautifully different brains, our humanity will forever be tied to determinism, and thus the loops are created. Hurt people hurt people. And I think that that is the key to breaking out of our loops inside and out of the show. And I think that that is how this story will end. Hosts present the ability to view humanity outside of itself and give us a clear image about how we are all uniquely different people trying to do our very best at what we believe that we should do. All of us have our own mental health struggles. There is no normal or abnormal human. And for the most part, all of us can be whatever we want to be, but we ignore many of our problems because of a culture that taught us toxic things. And once we break the chains, we can finally be free. Finally have free will, just like the robots in an HBO show about robots. But with that, we come to the end of the video. There are more parts of this theory that I would like for us to consider, such as medication and the drugs that are shown throughout the series. I believe that that might be explored more in this season, but I believe that all of that falls to the side, and this is ultimately the most clear and concise image that I could construct for this theory. So I don't want to muddy it up anymore. I have another 4 pages of text that I have removed from the script because it didn't add more than just the supporting evidence for these claims. And I don't want the video to be an hour long. If you watch this series, keep this theory in mind. You will absolutely see the markers of it appear, and I hope to see your comments about them in the next video and every video after. If there are any massive, supporting points for evidence or evidence that you believe contradicts this theory, please add them to the comments below so that we can become smarter and stronger together. Socratic Method, baby. I'm all ears, and I hope that you are too. Special shout out to Michael Linck and everyone over on the Patreon that makes this content possible. You really inspire me to continue theory crafting about this show, and I'm curious about my own mental health. I think I'm constantly questioning why I think that I need validation from strangers on the internet, and why ultimately it makes me feel so good to be in this moment, to literally be talking to you right now is the happiest that I feel on most days. Who's to say if that's a good or a bad thing? All I know is that I appreciate you all so very much for being here. So much love, everybody. And I cannot wait to talk to you all again soon.